SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good morning, dear students. Welcome to my class. This is lecture number 29. In this lecture, we will be discussing different stages of colonialism. First of all, before going into study the different stages of colonialism in India, let us start with the different views on colonialism. What do you mean by colonialism? There is no unanimous opinion among the scholars regarding what colonialism is. Different scholars have defined colonialism in different ways. Now, we can see the different versions given by scholars regarding the nature of colonialism or what colonialism means. One group of scholars argue that it was a traditional society with pre-colonial socio-economic elements. Others believe that colonialism represents a transitional society, that it was a transition from a traditional society with polity, economy and society of pre-colonial society to modern capitalist society. One group of scholars have argued that it was a transitional stage from pre-colonial socio-political and economic conditions to modern capitalist society, and this transitional stage comes to known as colonialism. But many other scholars believe that it was nothing than political domination or foreign political rule. It is considered as colonialism by many scholars. Then let us have a look at the nature of colonialism. What is the nature of colonialism? It leads underdevelopment in a colony, but modern industrial development in colonial masters. In a colonial setup, there are two countries, one is colony and the other one is colonial master. As far as our country is concerned, India was a colony and Britain was a colonial master. There exists two countries. And another nature was that the economic development in colonial master, but economic exploitation in colony. We have seen in one of the previous lectures that Britain exploited India economically. So, it leads economic development in colonial master. Britain witnessed industrialization and economic development, while what did happen in India? It was economic exploitation. It was the colony whose economic interests were subordinated to the interests of the colonial master. Another nature of colonialism was uprooting of society and economy in colony. We will be looking at how a British administration in India uprooted the traditional society and economy in our country. Even though the colony did not form the part of industrial revolution or the development of capitalist production, it becomes the part of the capitalist system through the intervention of the colonial master. With the intervention of Britain, India became the part of the world capitalist system. Then impact on colony. By colonialism, what did take place in colony? The political and economic developments in a colony are not determined according to the needs of the colony, but the political and economic developments in a colony are determined by the colonial master according to the needs of the colonial master, and it means the subordination of the colony to the needs of the imperialist power, that is commercialization of agriculture and the plantation sector are the best examples of it. Then another impact was that economic exploitation of the colony. Stages of colonialism. What are the different stages of colonialism? There is no unified stage as far as colonialism is concerned. Throughout the colonialism, one character is clear: subordination of the colonial country to the needs of the colonial master, as well as economic exploitation. These two characteristic features remain throughout the colonial period, but the nature of exploitation only stands different. In different stages, different forms or types of exploitation are being used by the colonial master. The colonialism linked to following factors: historical development of capitalism as a world system, changing pattern of the individual imperialist countries' economic, social and political development, changing position it occupies in the world system, colonies' own historical development. All these affect the stages of colonialism. As far as India is concerned, there are three different stages. As far as India is concerned. Each stage is different from another one with regard to the subordination of colonial economy, society and polity. In each stage, the nature of subordination of economy, polity and society have been different. Hence, the colonial policies, political and administrative institutions in these different stages are different. They used to adopt different administrative, political and colonial policies in a colony. The responses of the colonial people to the colonial master would also not be same everywhere. It differed from colony to colony. But the content of the stage of colonialism remains more or less the same whenever and wherever it occurs. However, we do not see a complete breakdown from one stage to another. Now, coming to colonialism in modern India, this period under study is from 1757 to 1857 and from 1857 to 1947. the basic character of colonialism in India was not the same from the period of 1757 to 1947. The nature was different in different stages. The stages of colonialism in India can be divided into three stages. The first stage of Indian colonialism was from 1757 to 1813. That is from the Battle of Plassey, when the British acquired political control in India, until 1813 with the passage of the Charter Act of 1813. And this first stage of colonialism in India came to be known as the period of monopoly trade and direct appropriation, or the period of East India Company domination. It was the period of the domination of English East India Company with the passage of the Charter Act of 1813. The monopoly of the English East India Company came to an end. It also lost its political domination. It was to require to run the administration of India subject to the sovereign power of the British Crown. So, with the passage of the Charter Act of 1813, the political and the commercial powers of the English East India Company got sizably reduced. Through the passage of Charter Act of 1813, the monopoly of the English East India Company in trade came to an end. And this first stage, spanning from 1757 to 1813, popularly known as mercantilism. The second stage, it was from 1813 to 1860. This period comes to be known as laissez-faire or free trade, period of free trade. It was from 1813 with the passage of the Charter Act to 1860. The third stage came to be known as financial imperialism. It was from 1860 to 1947. This was the third stage. Now, we are going to study the characteristic features of each stage, starting with the first stage of colonialism. During the first stage, the English East India Company had two different basic objectives. One was monopoly of trade with India. What do you mean by monopoly of trade? It means that no other English or European merchants or trading companies should not compete with English East India Company in the purchase of Indian manufactured products and its sale in Europe. The English East India Company came to India and purchased Indian manufactured products, which had a great demand in Europe. The company purchased Indian manufactured products and sold it in Europe. The difference between the purchasing price and the selling price was the profit of the company. And the company would be in a position to accumulate profit if there were no other rival competitors. They also did not want to end the competition from the rival European countries like French, Dutch and Portuguese. They also wanted to end the competition from the side of the Indian merchants. by establishing the monopoly of the English East India Company, the company was able to buy Indian products at low prices, and it was in a position to sell these products at a high price in Europe, and it could accumulate profit. And the Indian economic surplus could be accumulated through monopoly of trade. It was one of the objectives set out by the English East India Company to establish monopoly of trade through which they could accumulate profit by engaging in trading activities. And the English East India Company engaged in protracted wars against other European rivals. In South India, they engaged in Carnatic wars with the French, and they also engaged with the Dutch on battlefield. The company also was to acquire monopoly of trade against the Indian traders as well. And in order to prevent the Indian rulers from competing with the English East India Company, the company took the advantage of the decline of the Mughal Empire in India. With the decline of the Mughal Empire, the company was able to acquire political control in different parts of India. So, there was no all India power to check the advances of the English East India Company in India. And once they got political power in Bengal, the company began to employ the weavers directly, and these weavers were forced to produce these cotton and silk products at low prices determined by the British. In addition to revenue from monopoly of trade, they also accumulated wealth through control over state power. After getting political power in Bengal, they began to get land revenue from the peasants. But two types of revenues the English East India Company got. One, commercial revenue, that is by purchasing Indian products from India and selling it Europe. Secondly, territorial revenue, that is land revenue collected from the peasants. These two types of revenues English East India Company got. And why did the English East India Company got this large amount of money? They needed money to wage wars in India as well as on the seas, to fight against the rival European powers as well as against the Indian powers. It was because of the immense wealth of Bengal which the British got through the battles of Plassey and battles of Bexar. The British was able to defeat Tipu Sultan in South India, and it was because of the immense reach of Bengal the British was able to defeat the European rival French in the Carnatic wars. And money was also required for the English East India Company to fight against the European rivals, Indian rulers, as well as the cost of maintaining naval forces, forts and armies around the trading posts. The English East India Company did not possess such resources to finance the military operations against the Indian powers, nor to fight against the European rivals. All these monies they got from India. This Indian money was needed to purchase Indian goods. Till the Battle of Plassey, the Britishers brought gold and silver to India for the purchase of Indian goods and for sale in Europe. But after the Battle of Plassey and Bexar, British did not bring gold and silver to India. Wherefrom did they get money to purchase these Indian manufactured products for its sale in Europe? The Indian money was used for the purchase of indigenously manufactured products from India. The revenue they received in the form of land tax from Bengal was used for the purchase of Indian manufactured products for sale in Europe. After 1757, the Britishers did not bring gold and silver. After the acquisition of political power in Bengal through the battles of Plassey and Bexar, the weavers were forced to sell the products at a low price. During this stage, there was no import of British goods from Britain to India, because during this stage spanning between 1757 and 1813, these British goods could not compete with Indian manufactured products in quality, because there were no buyers for British imported goods. Only after the introduction of the industrialization, the British goods got demand from India. But till 1813, Britain did not import British manufactured products from Britain to India. From the territorial revenue, the British got in the form of land tax from the peasants and commercial revenue by engaging trade, by purchasing indigenously manufactured products at a low price and sale in Europe. They also engaged in illegal trade, that is the trade by the company officials. There was a struggle in Britain among the aristocracy as well as the landed gentry for getting appointments in India. During this stage, during the first stage of mercantilism, the English East India Company did not disturb the existing administrative system or the cultural affairs of the Indians, but they continued to exploit India by engaging trade as well as collecting land tax from Bengal. And now we are going to look how Indian revenues drained out from India to Britain during the first stage. As you have been told earlier, till the Battle of Plassey they brought gold and silver, but after which they did not bring any gold and silver for the purchase of Indian goods. Indian money they used for the purchase of Indian goods and sold it in Europe. However, they did not bring any gold and silver after the Battle of Plassey. The export of indigenously manufactured products from India to Britain continued as before. It was possible because the surplus money was left with the British. Surplus money is that after the acquisition of political power in Bengal, they began to collect land revenue, and the surplus money, the land revenue collected by the British, and the dues payable to Nawab of Bengal. He was paid 53 lakh rupees per annum. But the surplus money was left with the British. The British used this surplus money for the purchase of indigenously manufactured products from India for sale in Europe. This territorial revenue was used by the British for its commercial purposes. It was in this way the goods from India got exported to Britain. But what did India receive in return from Britain? India received nothing from Britain. It was the unilateral transfer of funds. Only the wealth of India was drained out of the country to Britain. In addition to its commercial purposes, the British also used the land revenue from Bengal for its military operations against other Indian rulers. You have been told that this money was used for military operations against Tipu Sultan in Mysore, as well as the European rival French. In addition to that, they also used it to finance companies' investment in China to purchase tea and Chinese silk. This Chinese silk and tea were purchased by English East India Company by using Indian products. Cotton, ivory were sold to Chinese. They did not accept British goods during this time, but was by accepting indigenously manufactured products from India, these British bought tea and Chinese silk from China. This process continued in full swing during the period between 1765 and 1813. In addition to that, the officials of the English East India Company also engaged in private trade. The Dastaka or duty free pass was only given to English East India Company, but the officials of the English East India Company began to use for their own trade. It was another way through which Indian funds drained out to Britain from India. Not all sent from India to Britain was business profit. In addition to business profit, it included wealth acquired by the Englishmen through plunder and war booty, then bribery obtained from regional principalities, business profit through fraudulent dealings. All these wealth drained out from India to Britain. G. A. Prinsep gave an estimate about the transfer of wealth from India to Britain. The third channel of transfer of wealth from India to Britain was a payment made with the English East India Company. It included the salary of the officials of the English East India Company. This was the third channel through which Indian money was drained from India to Britain. That is, the salaries of the officials of the English East India Company were paid from Indian money. Then the interest on loans taken by English East India Company from the Bank of England was paid from Indian revenue. Dividends to the stockholders of the company was paid from Indian revenue. All these came into known as home charges. It was from 1 crore to 3 crore rupees per annum. All these monies were drained from India to Britain. In return, in India did not receive anything. All these formed the first stage. During the first stage, the English East India Company exploited in India by purchasing indigenous goods at a low price and sale in Europe, and in addition to that they collected territorial revenue, land tax from Bengal, and the surplus money was left with the British to finance in their commercial purposes. But these were the different ways of exploitation. In addition to that, home charges were paid from India to Britain, war duty, and these were the different channels through which Indian wealth was went to Britain. Now coming to this stage, this first stage came into known as mercantilism. Now we are going to study the second stage. What were the characteristic features of the second stage of colonialism? The form of exploitation was different during the second stage. It came into known as colonialism of free trade. It was the period of free trade from 1813 to 1860 was the period of the free trade. During the second stage, how did the British exploit India? And a change took place during the second stage. In the first decade of the 19th century, industrialization reached at a better stage, and because of the industrialization, factories sprang up every nook and corner of Britain, and these factories required raw materials as well as market to sell machine made goods. India was made as a supplier for raw materials to feed the machines in British factories, as well as India was considered as a best market for selling British manufactured products. Earlier, British goods were not demanded in India, but with the industrialization, the quality of British goods improved. Now the demand for the British goods increased with the process of industrialization. Earlier, before 1813, there were no buyers, but after the industrialization process, the prices of these machine made goods were low and the quality was high. Earlier, it was not possible for these British manufactured goods to compete with the Indian goods, but now the situation totally changed. With the process of the industrialization, it was possible for the British manufactured goods to compete with the Indian manufactured goods. And with the process of industrialization, the British manufactured goods began to fill with Indian markets. But in the first stage of colonialism, Indian manufactured goods were exported from India to Europe. But a reverse in trade took place now. Now, British manufactured goods began to import on an extensive scale and began to fill with the Indian markets. So, they were no longer required Indian manufactured products. So, they wanted only agricultural products, raw materials to feed their machines. And another change took place in the beginning of the second stage of colonialism with the passage of the Charter Act of 1813. the English East India Company lost its trade monopoly. Now, this trade was open to other private companies in Britain as well as private persons. Other private companies and British persons now were able to come to India to engage trade. Earlier, it was exclusively reserved for the English East India Company. With the passage of the Charter Act of 1813, trade with India was open to all in Britain, be it private companies or private person. In addition to this trade monopoly, the Charter Act of 1813 also affected its political supremacy. Under the Charter Act of 1813, there was a clear mention in it that the English East India Company would control Indian possessions subject to the sovereignty of the British Crown. Now, the sovereignty was left with the British Crown, not with the English East India Company. And in this Charter Act, it was made clear that India should be governed for the interest of the British capitalist. So, because of this changing nature of exploitation, changes were made in the economic field as well. An era of free trade was started. The second stage from 1813 to 1860 came into known as an era of free trade. Why did it call free trade? Because all import duties in India were either totally removed or drastically reduced. With the reduction of import duties on goods imported from Britain to India, it was possible for British industrialists to export these machine-made British goods in a large scale from Britain to India. Thus, India was open to British manufacturers. The British goods began to flow from Britain to India with the reduction of import duties. Free entry was now given. In addition to the removal of import duty on the export of goods from Britain to India, the British capitalists were now developed tea plantations, coffee, indigo plantations, engage in trade, transport, mining industry. All these sectors were also opened to British capitalists. And during this period, railway was introduced by the British. Why did the railway introduced by the British? For commercial purposes. From the commercial point of view, railway was introduced for the transport of raw materials from interior parts of the country to port. Now, India was made a colony producing cheap agricultural raw materials like cotton, opium, indigo, silk, and the materials required for manufacturing in Britain. For the raw materials were to be collected from interior parts of the country. From these interior parts, the raw materials were to collect and brought to port. cotton, silk, sugar, jute. All these agricultural raw materials were cultivated in the interior parts of the country. From these interior parts, these agricultural raw materials were to brought into port. Likewise, from Britain, these British manufactured products reached the port, and from this port, it was to brought it to market in interior parts. And for these two purposes, railway was considered as a chief mode of transport. To transport raw materials from the interior parts of the country to port, where from these agricultural raw materials enshipped from Indian ports to Britain. And these British manufactured products were enshipped from British ports to Indian ports. And from these Indian ports, these British manufactured products were to brought to interior markets. And in addition to railways, other means of communication through water transport and road transport were also strengthened by the British during this stage for trade. During this stage, administration was made elaborate. The civil servants were recruited and they began to control the district. Law and judicial structures strengthened. Fauchidari Adalat, Diwani Adalat, Sadar Nizamat Adalat, Sadar Diwani Adalat began to play a key role in settling the disputes. Criminal law and the law of contract modified according to colonial interest. All these changes were made for the protection of their colonial interest or trade. It was during this period governmental intervention in education was ensured. Through the Macaulay Minutes of 1835, English system of learning was introduced in India. In these minutes, Macaulay himself categorically stated that the purpose of English education was to create a class of Indians to serve the Britishers at the lowest levels of administration. The aim of English education was not the intellectual upliftment of the Indians, but to create a class of Indians to support the Britishers at the lowest levels of administration. The tax on the peasants increased to maintain the civil and military administration as well as for the construction of railways. India observed during this period from 1813 to 1860, it was the period of second stage of colonialism. During this period, India observed 10 to 12% of British exports. After 1850, India began to import engine coaches from railway companies in Britain, rail lines and other rail stores. When railway was introduced in other part of the world, these industries began to develop in the same countries where railway construction was started. But in India, coincided with the introduction of the railways, the railway related industries did not develop. But all these materials for the construction of railways were imported from Britain to India. Even coal was imported for the first decade. the British used Indian army for its colonial expansion in other parts of Asia and Africa. It was another form of exploitation. These were the forms through which Britain exploited India during the second stage. During the second stage, British manufactured products began to fill with Indian markets. India was made the colony supplying agricultural raw materials like cotton, indigo, tobacco, jute, silk. These materials were exported from India to Britain, and in order to suit their trade interest, changes were made in administration, judiciary and education. All these form what comes it known as the second stage. Now we are going to study the third and the final stage of the colonialism. It commenced in 1860s. This stage was the era of foreign investments and international competition for colonies. From this very nomenclature, it is clear the characteristics of the third stage, that is foreign investments and international competition for colonies. It is popularly known as financial imperialism. The third stage of colonialism in India came into known as financial imperialism. This change took place because of the several factors in world economy. Let us start with what were the changes. Initially, Britain was the center of industrialization. It was the world laboratory where machines were initially used for the production of goods. But the process of industrialization spread to several other countries of Europe, United States of America and the Asian country of Japan. Japan industrially developed. With this, the industrial supremacy of Britain came to an end. Initially, Britain, through the factory production, dominated the world economy, but with the spread of industrialization in other parts of the world, its monopoly in industrialization came into an end. The process of industrialization intensified because of the application of scientific knowledge to industry. In addition to it included modern chemical industries, use of petroleum and electricity for industrial purpose. With this scientific advancement in technology, the process of industrialization got intensified. Coincided with the intensification of the process of industrialization, the means of international transport also strengthened. Because of the process of industrialization, these countries required more raw materials and more markets. These countries engaged in massive production of industrial goods. They required raw materials in large extent, as well as to find a market to sell these manufactured goods. It resulted the accumulation of capital among the industrialists, and with the accumulation of capital, these industrialists were looking for an opportunity to invest their capital and to further accumulate profit. Because of the process of industrialization, they got money and was eagerly looking for an opportunity to invest this money and to get further profit. And the position of Britain was challenged because of the spread of industrialization in other parts of Europe, United States of America and Japan. Because of this spread of industrialization, Britain began to weak. In this background, Britain took concrete steps to consolidate its power on India. But these were the reasons why Britain consolidated its position over India. Earlier, reactionary imperialist policies had been used by the governor generals, but now it was replaced by liberal imperialist policies. It can easily be hacked from the viceroyalties of Lord Lytton, Lord Dufferin. It was during the period of Lord Dufferin, Indian National Congress was created, as well as Lord Curzon. After 1850, large amount of British capital invested in India, because this capital began to accumulate. The industrialists in Britain, and they were looking for an opportunity to invest. They brought this money to India to invest in railways. They gave this money to Government of India's loan. They invested in trade as well as they invested in plantations. They invested money in coal mining industries, jute mills, shipping and banking sectors in India. India also performed another important role for Britain. The Indian Army and the financial resources of India were used during the third stage for the colonial expansion of Britain in other parts of the world. So, the British government in India was required to maintain a huge standing army for its colonial purposes in other parts of the world. In 1904, this huge standing army absorbed 52% of the total revenue of the country. During the third stage, the colonial administration reached every nook and corner of India. The administration now controlled by the bureaucrats, and the British administration became more effective during the third stage compared to the two other earlier stages. Railways were built faster, and the British declared that Indians were unfit to rule themselves. So, that is why the British came to India to administer Indians as benevolent despotism. But it was in this third stage the national movement started by the Indians against the British, which finally culminated with the independence of India in 1947. These are the major questions from this topic. Examine the features of the first stage of colonialism. What were the methods adopted by British to strengthen their rule in India in the latter half of the 19th century? What were the forms of exploitation in the second stage of capitalism? Thank you, students, for watching my class. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Gillette Sam and I teach sociology at IIT Kanpur. Today I am going to tell you about an important debate that is occurring around the concept of globalization. Now, uh, within the study of globalization, there are two sets of people. The first set of people argue that globalization is very real. It's something that is happening around us all the time, and in fact, it's something that is gaining strength over time. The second set of people, and the first set of people are called the globalists. The second set of people are not so convinced that globalization is something real, and they are referred to as skeptics. Now, the skeptics argue that unlike what the globalists would have us believe, that there are things and ideas and people that are traveling across the world, across multiple borders, and that we live in an interconnected world, actually, there are many parts of the world and many types of people who are completely left out of these kind of global flows. So they would give you the example of typically indigenous communities who live across the world. And they would argue that if you look at the lives of indigenous communities, particularly tribes that are quite isolated in terms of their physical location, their lives continue without their participating in any kind of global flows. To this, the globalists would respond that even though people may live in isolated and remote locations and they may not be directly involved in global flows, their lives today are still being influenced by events that are happening at a global scale. You can take the example of climate change. So, for instance, if there is an indigenous community that has no contact with anyone else in the world apart from themselves, but they live in an area which is experiencing an increase in sea levels and increase in the temperature. All of this may be attributed to people in neighboring countries, or actually rather events that are happening across the globe. So in that sense, even though you may not be directly participating in global flows, your everyday life is affected by what is happening around the world. Another argument that the skeptics make is in regard to what happens with the nation states. Now, initially, when discussions about globalization started, and we are talking about the 1990s, the expectation was that the nation state as an entity is going to wither away. It's going to cease to be important. Now, skeptics could point out to the world today and say, well, nation states are still important. We still live our lives based on which nation we were born in or which nation we have citizenship in. Their rules and regulations are still important for us. To which globalists would argue that this expectation that the nation state will cease to be important, that itself is a fallacy. Rather than facing a situation that the nation states state becomes less important over time, we actually may be headed towards a situation where, in addition to the nation state, there are other laws which become important to our lives, and they shape our lives on an everyday basis.